Very good morning to you. Nick Conrad with you on the programme that's getting the whole county talking on BBC Radio Norfolk. Listeners to this programme come through with the most amazing stories. They provoke a whole range of emotions and discussions. But one call a few months ago really affected us all here and many of you at home. Back in May, we were talking about being afraid of death following a controversial BBC documentary which showed an elderly man passing away. The switchboard was inundated with people's experiences of coping when a loved one falls ill and are faced with death. Then came a call from Sandra. Her son had been in a persistent vegetative state for 9 years. I decided to go to see her. Her name's Sandra Bell. She lives in Loddon in Norfolk. And I wanted to know more about her story. Here it is. Sandra, we're looking at a picture of Ed.
Yes, yeah, this is a picture taken this summer. As you can see, Ed's really looking quite nice. He's not always like that. Sometimes he's asleep, but on that particular day he was wide awake and obviously looking at what was going on around him.
Take me back to when he was 14, when this all began.
When Ed was 14, we woke one night to the sound of a bang, and we realised that Ed was having a massive seizure. So he was rushed off to hospital and tests were run, but it was thought that it was probably one of those things and that we shouldn't worry unless it happened again.
And then further along down the line, there was another episode, and then a bit more light was shed on the condition.
Yes, that's right. About 6 months later, he had another seizure, and that's when they decided to run tests. And that revealed that there was something present in his head.
And I know it's very difficult because you'll have so much medical terminology, which is very confusing, but in layman's terms, what was inside his head? What was the problem?
At that stage, we didn't know. They just said that there is something there. We've found something. This needs to be explored further. So then Ed was referred to Addenbrooke's, and he underwent a lot more tests, MRI scans, and also he had an angiogram, and the result of that came out that he actually had what we call an AVM, which is an arteriovenous malformation, which is, I have to say, extremely rare.
And it is just a clump of veins and arteries that haven't properly formed, that have banded together, but can be very dangerous if they bleed.
Well, it's actually veins and capillaries, as far as I know, yes. It's something that we were told he was born with, but up until he was 14 and had the first seizure, he was just the most beautiful boy. He was happy, go lucky, jokey, just living life to the full, enjoying school, enjoying spending time with his friends, and absolutely adored being with his family and his pets.
What was it like knowing that there was something inside your beautiful son's body that could potentially cause him a great deal of distress or indeed even be fatal in the future?
It was a nightmare. It was very difficult. From the night that he had the first seizure, I don't think I've had a good night's sleep since then, because I was always worried that something would happen to him. And discovering that he had something so rare and so potentially life-threatening made it pretty much, well, really hard to comprehend and to actually believe. It was the start of what became a massive nightmare, really. And Edward himself, he just hated the thought. You know, he would wake up each morning and he'd say thank you, because he had got through the night without a seizure, and he hadn't had a bleed, which is what can happen if you have an AVM and it's not treated.
What was his big fear and your big fear?
I think for both of us, the fear was of dying, of something happening. When we were at Addenbrooke's, we were told that basically there were two choices, that Ed could have nothing done, no treatment, but that as Ed had grown, so had the AVM. It was something that he had born with, and by the time he was 15, it had reached about the size of a golf ball, and as it had the two seizures, the chances are that something was happening and that he would have a bleed. It may have been very soon, but on the other hand, it may have not have been until several years down the line. And Ed just felt that he couldn't cope with that. It was like a cloud hanging over his head all the time. He couldn't take part in contact sports. It altered his whole outlook on life. And he just, well, we had the other option that we had was of treatment. And we were told that if he went through a series of treatment, there was a 5% of something going wrong throughout the whole course of treatment, which would have involved, or which did involve embolisation, and would then have gone on to involve radiation and finally surgery. Sadly for Edward, we didn't get further than the first embolisation point. He worked it all out in his own head. We constantly asked him, was he sure, because of the risks, and he was adamant that this was his choice. So however we felt as a family, all we could do was support Edward and go along with his decision.
So he bravely went down to Addenbrooke's, well, you all did as a family, and they were going to try and glue this, let's think of it as a golf ball, of veins and capillaries together so they wouldn't bleed, they wouldn't leak. And even though it's a very complex procedure, everybody was very optimistic.
Yes, we were at that stage, yes. I mean, we were extremely nervous, as anybody would be, because the brain is such a complex organ, the most complex in the body, and any interference with it can cause problems. We were told that if anything were to go wrong at all, it would probably just be that he would be left with a slight weakness down one side, similar to that of if he had had a slight stroke or something, or that possibly his speech may be affected a little bit, but we were reassured that with speech therapy, everything would be fine.
What was it like being in there and seeing your son in a bed and knowing that they were going to have to deal medically with such a delicate, precious area, the brain? I can only imagine how horrible it was to leave Ed and to walk out of that room looking at him thinking, what on earth are you about to go through?
Oh, it was horrendous. Ed was a fun boy. He was a joker. He was always teasing me. And the last words that he spoke to me when I left him in the operating theatre, when the anaesthetist said to him, I'm now going to put a needle in Edward so that you go to sleep. You'd probably rather look at Mum than the needle. And Ed said, no, I think I'd rather look at the needle. And so we laughed, and that was actually the last conversation that I had with Edward.
How did the operation go?
Well, to all intents and purposes, it appeared to have gone fine. We were told to ring up at 2:00 to see if Edward was on the ward. We rang and they said, no, he's not back yet. Would you like to ring us back at 3:00? And we were waiting in a room where we were staying at the hospital. And at 2:55, the phone rang and somebody said, can you come now, please? Ed has arrested. Surgeon then came to me and said that we need to take Ed for an urgent scan. And we sat in the matron's office waiting, and shortly later he came back and he said, Edward has had a massive bleed and we need to operate. Do you give us permission? And obviously I said yes. And then followed the interminable wait. We were absolutely lost, praying with all our might that everything was going to be okay. Several hours later, the team came down and they said the operation has been successful as far as we can tell. We've managed to stop the bleed, and while we were there, we've also removed the AVM, so there will be no further need for Edward to have treatment. We're hopeful of a good recovery. He may possibly have some weakness, but at this point we're optimistic.
But unfortunately, even though they're optimistic, it turned out in the end to be a false dawn and things hadn't quite worked out how everyone had hoped.
That's right, yes. Ed went into intensive care and we were able to see him there. He looked completely different to the way he'd looked that very morning when I'd, unknowingly said goodbye to him. Almost unrecognisable, in fact, with all the tubes and with the work that they'd had to do on his head. We stayed with him, and that happened on the Wednesday, and a few days later we had to come home. There were one or two things that we had to sort out, and we came home just briefly for one night. We got back early the next morning, and the nurse that was in charge of looking after Edward said, "Oh, hello, Mum. Ed's been a little bit naughty while you've been gone. We haven't been able to stabilise his blood pressure." After that, he went for another scan, and it turned out that in that short spell of time that I'd left him, he had had a massive stroke because his body couldn't cope with the shock of the surgery that he had been through.